who was going out. And whenever they would bring me back, I would just tear my hair and say, "Oh, what are they doing to us?" Unquote. The prosecution will tender evidence establishing the many crimes of systematic sexual violence perpetrated against women in places like Karaman's house in Foča, Foča High School, and the Partisan Hall. Here on slide 63, Mladić records a report from Ljubislav Simić from Bratunac that a 64% Muslim population in Bratunac has been reduced to 2 individual Muslims. Quote, "In Bratunac municipality, we now have 2 Muslims," unquote. As the scourge of ethnic cleansing continued and took full effect in eastern Bosnia, those ethnically cleansed gathered in the 3 eastern enclaves of Srebrenica, Žepa, and Gorazde. The success of the 3rd strategic objective was left unfulfilled by 1993. The VRS's move towards the town of Srebrenica was halted by the intervention of UNPROFOR in 1993. General Morion would make his well-known promise to the people of Srebrenica, and in the years of 1993 to 1995, the eastern enclaves of Srebrenica, Žepa, and Gorazde survived under UN protection. Here on slide 64, we can see an entry from Mladić's military notebook recording Morion's admonition to resist any urge he may have to ethnically cleanse these areas. The situation in eastern Bosnia largely remained for 2 years. During this period, Muslim fighters from the enclaves raided surrounding Serb communities, on some occasions committing terrible war crimes themselves. The situation remained volatile during the months leading up to July 1995. The people in the eastern enclaves would remain under threat until the time Mladić would order the takeover of Srebrenica and Žepa. Slide 65 is an excerpt from the evidence of David Harland, a senior UN official. It recounts the situation in which Mladić threatened to kill everyone in the eastern enclaves unless 22 VRS prisoners of war were returned to him. As Harland points out, such threats were not uncommon for Mladić. I will not spend time on the implementation of the 4th and 6th strategic objective. Although crimes were also committed in furtherance of these goals, the indictment does not contain any specific crimes arising from them. I will now turn to the 5th strategic objective, the division of Sarajevo. Before the war, Sarajevo was emblematic of the Yugoslav ideal. 500,000 people of all ethnicities living together, working side by side, raising their children together, celebrating each other's happy occasions. The compact geography of the city circled a true interethnic community, prosperous and peaceful. Marriage across ethnic lines was not uncommon, and though many identified themselves as Yugoslavs, others proudly and rightly identified themselves by their ethnic affiliation. Beginning in 1991 and continuing into early 1992, the ethnic delineation of Sarajevo's neighborhoods and areas was a focus of SDS political activity. From December 1991, SDS organs in Sarajevo's greater urban area, territories including Pale, Ilyas, Ilija, and Novigrad, moved to unilaterally proclaim areas of existing municipalities as Serb. Tensions increased in the city during the spring of 1992. Barricades would be erected in early March, affecting the freedom of movement around the city. The barricades provoked a popular response, with thousands of protesters marching to demand their removal. Peace demonstrations took place intermittently over the next month, while Serb forces used the time to expand their control over institutions and areas around the city. On the 4th of April, the police school in Vraća, a high point south of Sarajevo's main thoroughfare, was taken over. On 6th of April, Sarajevans of all ethnicities responded to the rising tension with a peaceful march in the center of the city. The crowd dispersed when gunmen shot into the crowd from the Holiday Inn. Between the 4th of April and mid-May 1992, the contours of Sarajevo's encirclement were established. The physical separation of Sarajevo's population along ethnic lines was well underway. The city was effectively dissected. Elements of the campaign of terror, the sniping and indiscriminate shelling of Sarajevo's citizens, was already a feature of their daily life. From April through May, Serb forces fought units fighting in the name of the Bosnian government, containing them in what would eventually be known as the inner ring around the city. Shelling and sniping of Sarajevo's central areas from the Serb-controlled hills had begun in a campaign that was to last until 1995. On the 6th of June, Mladić and Karadzic both would meet with SDS representatives from Serb-claimed Sarajevo municipalities. That same day, Mladić issued the first of his military directives to the VRS, Directive Number 1. It called for the cleansing of those parts of Sarajevo with a majority Serb population and cutting it along an axis defined by Bosnian Serb leaders. It included an order for the military implementation of the first and fifth strategic goals in the Sarajevo area. While Serb leaders held on to the notion of ethnic division as a primary principle of their vision for Sarajevo, they quickly recognized that their stranglehold on the city offered an opportunity for an important strategic advantage. Every successive military directive called for the continued blockade of the city. The actual siege of Sarajevo advanced purposes separate and apart from the strategic objectives. In short, Sarajevo, the location of the newly established government of an independent Bosnia, was a pressure point, the place where Bosnian Serbs could exert pressure in an effort to influence negotiations or punished the Bosnian civilians for something that had occurred elsewhere in the country. At the 16th Assembly session in May 1992, Mladić described the encirclement of the city with artillery and snipers as a ring around its neck. He was acutely aware that he held the power to decide who entered and left the city, and exploited this power throughout the siege. I'm going to ask you to take a look at your screens, and I'm going to ask Ms. Stewart to play a media report by a former Sky News correspondent by the name of Arnout van Linden, in which Mladić talks about Sarajevo. After the video concludes, I will pause for a considerable period of time to be sure that the video has been fully translated into each of our languages.
He's the scourge of Sarajevo, the chief warrior of the Serbs. He's called Ratko Mladić. Appropriately, Ratko means warrior, and this square-jowled Serb general has lived up to the name. A commander always on the move, the visit to one of the mountain chalets where the Serbs of Bosnia have established their separatist government is but a fleeting one. In a short briefing, the commander-in-chief speaks only of attacks on his forces, never of offensives by them. And as if to prove the point, he gives us a rare chance to accompany him to frontline artillery positions where the UN observers are conspicuous by their absence. High up on the wind-swept hills, the 100mm guns are dug deep into the rocks directly overlooking Sarajevo, an overwhelming position of strength, which is obviously to the general's satisfaction. As he says, he holds the city in his palm, and many of the buildings in the haze below bear testimony to that power. Yet General Mladić is quite unrepentant. He's a man who has no doubts, only a total assurance that he's right, the world wrong, and that his people have been slandered.
I hope the UN Security Council.
We Serbs are a reality in this world, not some sort of extraterrestrials, and that we have the right to defend ourselves.
Nearby, more positions are being dug. In the general's eyes, the world may deny his people their rights, but that's not going to stop him.
We have to fight as long as we continue to exist, to defend ourselves. There is no other way, and we are prepared for a long war.
Far away from the battlefield, the UN is preparing a resolution on war crimes. It leaves Ratko Mladić quite unmoved.
I'm not bothered at all. I did not take part in any crimes. I have only defended my people.
With that, the general departs to inspect other front lines in a war neither he nor his officers believe will end any time soon. Arnout van Linden, Sky News, on the front lines outside Sarajevo.
Mladić would demonstrate his power over Sarajevo 2 weeks after he became commander of the main staff. Throughout May, there were contentious negotiations over the evacuation of the JNA barracks in Sarajevo. Skirmishes had taken place. After assuming command of the main staff in mid-May, Mladić threatened to retaliate against the city if any of the JNA personnel were attacked. He did just that. The following intercept concerns the shelling of Basčarcia, an area in the old town of Sarajevo. Mladić exacted his campaign of terror among its civilians, shell after shell after shell, not aimed at identifiable military targets, but scattered across the city in bombardments designed to cause panic and terror. There was no safety in knowing you were in a purely residential civilian neighborhood. In the intercept I will ask Ms. Stewart to now play, you will hear Mladić directing artillery fire at the densely populated Basharsia area in the Old Town. I would ask for you to listen to it now. The translation of what Mladić says can be found on slide 69.
How so can you fire? Well, I could fire in 5 to 10 minutes. No sooner than that. Tell me, can you also shell Basharsia? Yes, I can. I beg your pardon? I can. Fire salvo at Basharsia as well. Yes, sir.
Immediately after this bombardment, Mladić would record General John Wilson from the senior military liaison officer to the UN mission, conveying a personal appeal to Mladić from the then Secretary General Boutros Ghali. Mladić's notes are displayed in slide 70. The Secretary General expressed his concern at the destruction of the city. A week later, in furtherance of his first military directive, Mladić would unleash another ferocious barrage of artillery fire against the city. From the start, it was clear to the victims, to the perpetrators, to the world community watching on their televisions that the bombardment of the civilians of Sarajevo was a grave criminal act. Slobodan Milošević himself would acknowledge what was obvious to all. In this UN cable written by General Nambiar, he reports Milošević as describing these initial bombardments of Sarajevo as, quote, bloody criminal, unquote. To appreciate the siege of Sarajevo, to understand how it was conducted and why it caused such terror to Sarajevans, one must understand the city's topography. Sarajevo was situated in a deep valley along the Miljecka River, surrounded by hills to the north, east, and south. For the most part, Sarajevo was densely populated, a mixture of high-rise apartment blocks and compact residential 2- to 3-story houses on small plots of land, all within sight of the hills rising around the city. From any rooftop or high-rise window, Sarajevans could see Serb territory close by. In some areas, no more than a block away. Sarajevans lived with a sense of vulnerability that came with knowing every part of the city was within the range of Serb weaponry. Running down the main arteries of the city was its lifeline, the tram line. Until May 1992, Sarajevans from Alleges to the Old Town Center would come to the tram line to take it to work, to shop along its streets, to school, to the Old Town for a coffee with friends on the weekend. The tram was used each day by many, many Sarajevans. As Mladić himself said in May of 1992, quote, I have blocked Sarajevo from all 4 sides. There is no exit. It is in a mousetrap, unquote. To give you a sense of the proximity of the hills surrounding Sarajevo and the vulnerability of the entire city to artillery fire, I asked you that you look at a short clip of video taken from the turret of an artillery position. From 1992 until 1996, the Bosnian Serb goals in Sarajevo were to divide it and to use terror to exert pressure on the Bosnian leadership. The mechanisms of terror were simple: indiscriminate shelling, sniping of civilians, deprivation of the essentials of daily life, food, water, and humanitarian aid. As David Harland, a senior UN official, has testified, Sarajevo was a, quote, spigot of terror, unquote, one to be turned on and off as needed. Please remember this image. It is an apt characterization of what Sarajevo was to Mladić and other Bosnian Serb leaders. Quote, Sarajevo in the context of political objectives, that is, of getting the Muslims to negotiate, or in terms of deterring any NATO military attack on them, our sense was there was, as it were, a spigot of terror which they would open or close according to how much pressure was on them from the international community, or what political concessions they hoped to get from the other side. Your Honors, to give you a sense of what it was like to live in Sarajevo during the siege, we have created a compilation of news reports spanning the period of the indictment. The entire video is approximately 4 minutes long and will give you a sense of what happened when this spigot of terror was opened.
Dusk in Sarajevo. Amongst the city's ancient minarets, the rockets fall, heralding another night of heavy shelling. In Sarajevo, the crossroads can be lethal, need to be taken at speed. They and the avenues that cut across the city offer the Serb gunners in the hills above with open lines of fire. Prime targets which the old and the infirm are forced to accept as the new, uncomfortable realities of life. Sarajevo's burning, in its heart and in its suburbs.
Zijad Kojundzic is alive because he decided to listen to the 4 o'clock news last Friday afternoon. He left his family sheltering in the cellar and with his son Muriz went upstairs. While the news was on, the house was hit by a tank round. This morning, Mr. Kojundzic buried his wife, his daughter, 2 of his grandchildren, and a friend who'd come round to their house with some aspirin. The graveyard was shelled while they were there.
There isn't a time or a place where the citizens of Sarajevo can feel safe. Some parts of the city are more dangerous than others, but the shelling is indiscriminate and it kills people every day.
The lives of the people of Sarajevo get more difficult all the time. At least half the city is without water. A tap in a burnt-out kiosk near the ruins of the railway station has shorter queues than most because it is overlooked by a sniper. Guns fired with intent to kill are so much a part of the daily routine here that they hardly notice.
Even by the crazed standards of Sarajevo, a horrendous night. Each luminous blob deadly and indiscriminate. Deafening and relentless, artillery and mortar fire, speckled with machine gun and rifle bullets. In the dark places below are over 300,000 citizens, enduring a Serbian onslaught, possibly in retaliation for an attempt by the Bosnians to break out from the siege in the past few days.
This is supposed to be a safe area in the making. There was supposed to be a ceasefire. But the shelling has been getting worse for the last 48 hours, and today the people of Sarajevo suffered as much as on any day in this war. When the war was starting, sniping like this would have sent them to their cellars. These days, it's different. They know how to take cover, when to wait, and when to run. It's still terrifying and deadly, but like fetching water, it's part of the daily grind.
In Sarajevo, the horrors are not just heard of, but lived through day by day. This, a particularly heavy bombardment of the old city. A single artillery shell fell on a queue of people waiting to pick up water outside the brewery. 8 were killed, 18 seriously injured. Of the dead, 3 came from one family, the mother and father who were killed instantly, and the daughter.
The UN command was dispensing calm assurance, but it wasn't being felt at street level just afterwards, where people were fleeing from yet another sniper attack. We asked one of them how long it had been going on. 2.5 years, he said.
The efforts to cling to a kind of normality in Sarajevo are being undermined. Not yet driven underground and into shelters, much of the population is at risk. As this morning, a shell landing among people walking near the Holiday Inn. With only the occasional random lethal explosion, people are still walking to work, queuing for food or tending their allotments, taking a chance. But this morning, 5 were injured too seriously, and there's been sniper fire around the city.
I've already discussed Directive 1, which relates in part to Sarajevo. Other VRS military directives also apply to Sarajevo. These directives contained instructions for the military activities of the Sarajevo-Romania Corps. Slide 75 depicts 2 directives. Directive 3 was issued in August of 1992 and signed by Mladić. A portion of that directive is dedicated to the operational objectives of the Sarajevo-Romania Corps of the VRS, or the SRK. Every directive that was issued instructed the SRK to maintain the blockade of Sarajevo. Quote, keep Sarajevo firmly under blockade and prevent its breaking. Directive 6, issued and signed by Karadzic as Supreme Commander, was promulgated in November 1993. It also contains instructions for the SRK, including the instruction to, quote, use the main body of forces to prevent the deblockade of Sarajevo. Throughout the course of the 44-month siege, the blockade of Sarajevo was unbroken. The city remained in the palm of Mladić's hand. The prosecution will meet its burden on the shelling component of the siege of Sarajevo in 2 ways. First, through evidence of Sarajevans and international observers who will describe significant periods of intense shelling of the city. Shelling that for the most part had no identifiable military purpose and in fact was clearly directed at terrorizing civilians. Second, the prosecution will meet its burden by leading evidence of a number of specific shelling crimes which are representative of the shelling campaign. I have already described 3 of these shelling crimes for you. The last shelling incident I will deal with in this opening is one in which a modified air bomb was used. These large, heavy, destructive bombs were designed to be dropped from planes, gravity taking them to their targets. With the imposition of a no-fly zone in October of 1992, such bombs could no longer be used with planes. Steps were taken to modify these bombs so that they could be launched from the hills overlooking Sarajevo. Powerful rocket motors were affixed so that they could be launched from purpose-built launching ramps. Without any mechanism to aim or steer them, these bombs were simply rocketed up into the sky above Sarajevo to fall haphazardly on the city below. These weapons were developed by the Yugoslav Army, and Mladić was directly involved in procuring them for use in and around Sarajevo. These large bombs were capable of causing great destruction and were notoriously inaccurate. The victims of modified air bombs were not only those living where they fell, but all those who knew such indiscriminate weapons were being regularly used by the VRS. The prosecution will lead detailed evidence of 3 air bomb attacks in the spring of 1995. I will focus on just one. It is briefly described in Schedule G10 of the indictment. On the 7th of April 1995, a modified air bomb was launched from a VRS launcher and fell onto a residential area in Hreznica at the foot of Mount Igman. Slide 76 is an order from the SRK Corps Commander Dragomir Milosevic. Here on the 6th of April 1995, he issued the following order. Quote, the Alleges Brigade will immediately prepare a launcher with an aerial bomb and transport the bomb for launching. The most profitable target must be selected in Hreznica and Sokolovici colony, where the greatest casualties and material damage would be inflicted. Slide 77, a report sent to the main staff the next day, shows that the order was carried out. In Alleges Brigade, one 120 millimeter shell was fired and one 250-kilogram aerial bomb was launched at the center of Hreznica. This particular bomb destroyed civilian houses, killed 1 civilian, and wounded 3 others. Ziba Chustovic was home drinking her morning coffee when the bomb killed her. Prosecution evidence will establish that the use of heavy weapons was controlled through an established, centralized military hierarchy. The following is an example of the type of document the prosecution will tender to establish this. Here on slide 78, we can see an order from the main staff to the SRK command. The main staff retained to itself the authorization to use heavy weapons, authority which it might delegate to the corps level, but no further down the military hierarchy. Quote, VRS main staff decides on the use of aerial bombs and possibly a corps if the VRS main staff approves so, and not a brigade according to its own plan. In future, they cannot directly address without your approval, unquote. Later that year, on the 7th of November, 1994, Mladić himself would issue an order reserving to himself the decision to use heavy caliber weapons on civilian targets in Sarajevo. In this order, we can see Mladić's direct involvement when it related to civilian targets. He says here in paragraph 3, quote, "I forbid all use of weapons of bigger caliber on civilian targets in Sarajevo without my approval," unquote. There can be no doubt that Mladić, subject to Karadžić's authority, controlled the shelling of Sarajevo. As Mladić says to John Wilson, he was going to make Sarajevo shake. Quote, "Make sure that your soldiers are aware that Sarajevo is going to shake. Sarajevo will shake. More shells will fall on per second than in the entire war so far," unquote. The command structure of the VRS was well developed and operated efficiently. Mladić was able to use it quickly to stop any shelling or sniping activities that may have been in progress. This ability was demonstrated during ceasefires when Karadzic and Mladić were able to deliver a ceasefire that had been reached in peace negotiations. Slide 81 is a report from the Sarajevo Romania Corps. It reports that the main staff of the VRS has issued a warning for troops not to take any action over Sarajevo because Karadzic has entered into a ceasefire agreement. Quote, "We received from the command of the main staff of VRS a warning not to act over proper Sarajevo. Act only in the case of necessary self-defense and endangering military defense lines. The warning is issued with regard to the agreement between President Karadzic, UNPROFOR, and our enemy." Command structures were in place for Karadzic and Mladić to start, stop, or modulate the shelling and sniping activity towards Sarajevo. The spigot, to use David Harlan's phrase, worked well. Your Honors, I'm about to move to the topic of sniping. May I inquire about the time the Chamber plans to take the next break so I can break accordingly?
Mr. Groom, I had on my mind to have the next break in approximately 5 minutes, but if it would be more suitable to take it now, then there's no problem.
Yes, Your Honor.
And we'll take a break and we'll resume at 25 minutes past 12.
All rise, fearful away.